But I want to welcome first our wonderful local author and Northeastern professor, Jeremy Bushnell. He has 3 exciting novels published by Melville House, including The Weirdness, The Insides, and now Relentless Melt. Each is about, I'm quoting, a magical claptrap, diabolical villainy, and ordinary human confusion. And if that's not exciting enough, he also authors the newsletter Wednesday Investigations. But you see, he does not just teach and write, for he is also a champion of collaborative visual art projects. He works on duo projects like The Morphic Rooms and Church Door Lounger, and has released abstract electronic music as half of Doubtful Forms and also by himself as Featherstone. These are fantastic names, and I can see where the writing really comes through, you know. And the writing has also led him to design a post-apocalyptic tabletop game, Inevitable, which you can play now while we all await the new role-playing game, The Meanings. But the book we are celebrating today is Relentless Melt. It is set here in Boston. The book is described perfectly by the delightful WBUR review that came out yesterday, as his latest novel is a fun, genre-bending revival of classic cosmic horror and detective fiction with a distinctly modern attitude. Woo! And then the other author we are featuring today is the wonderful Amy L. Clark, and they are also a local author here who teaches creative writing and literature at Emerson College. They have published a collection of stories with titles like Adulterous Generation and Wanting, the latter of which is part of a book called A Peculiar Feeling of Restlessness. We see their work in anthologies like A Norton Anthology of New Micro, Litro, The Baltimore Review, Juked, Fifth Wednesday, and Brilliant Flash Fiction. But today we are celebrating their first novel, Palais Royale, set in the hotel in Maine. Clark has woven a beautiful tale that navigates the trials of returning to one's hometown and all of the journeys that come with such an adventure. But I am extremely excited to hear both of these authors speak, so I'm going to pass it over. So please join me in welcoming them to the stage here at Brookline.
I'm willing to start. Sure. How's this microphone working for everyone? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, great. So I'm reading for the novel. I have a selection picked out. I'm going to just it's from the beginning of the novel, and so I don't need to give a ton of context. But what I will say is the protagonist's name is Artie Quick, and Artie is trying to figure something out. Artie is interested in studying criminal investigation. She is taking a course at what would eventually go on to become Northeastern. It's a place called the Evening Institute for Young Men, and they are offering a course in criminal investigation that she really wants to teach. She really wants to take. And because at that time, Northeastern is a school for young men, she's disguising herself in a suit that has been sort of purloined from her brother. During the day, she works at Filing's basement. At night, she's going to school and wearing the suit and sort of having big gender feelings, which is like a theme of the book. And she's sort of interested in like solving crimes or figuring out what crime means to a certain degree. She's interested in the concept of crime, and she wants to sort of figure out like, why would a life of crime tempt someone? At this point in the novel, it's like, oh, you know. So I'll begin here. This is from chapter 2. It begins at Filings. It's Friday morning, almost 9:30. The morning bell is about to ring, and when it does, the doors will open, letting the waves of shoppers in. Artie straightens the overcoats hanging on the nearest rack, even though she straightened them just a minute ago, and even though they'll be in complete disarray 15 minutes from now. She sighs, steels herself, runs her hands over the front of her plain wool dress, smoothing out the wrinkles. Artie started this job in the winter of 1908, when Edward Filene opened an overflow shop, the Tunnel Bargain Basement, to offer surplus merchandise from his department store, and needed to hire basically every young girl he could find to help staff it. The overflow shop was only supposed to be temporary, and Artie had expected only to be taken on as seasonal help. But it's almost a year later, and the popularity of the store hasn't waned. The doors have stayed open, and Artie has held on to the job. In a lot of ways, it's a good job. She only works a 10-hour day and only 5 days a week. Her father, a carpenter, works 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. It pays well, and she's been able to save a little money under her own name, since she's now enrolled in something called a credit union, the kind of cooperative bank that the store runs. Maybe even more than a little money at this point. She's always a bit surprised when she checks in on it and sees exactly how much she's accrued in her account. Mostly she tries not to think about it or talk about it. Her parents don't know that she has that money sitting there. In other ways, though, the job is pretty grueling. She'd been first drawn to Filene's by the shop windows, which depicted spacious, well-lit areas in which gowns seemed to float, suspended as though in a dream. She could envision herself in such a space, drifting among the garments, gesturing at them. She knew right from the outset that this vision was a fantasia. She knew when she applied that she was applying for a job, and that she needed to work hard, not just drift blissfully in a cloud of electric light. But the shop windows had unshakably invested Filene's with an aura of Parisian glamour. So when Artie imagined herself working there, she imagined working on the upper floors, which Artie knew from her first few curious forays into the store, were passably close to her fantasies. They were clean and airy and attended by attractive people. She's been asked to work on the upper floors 4 or 5 times, 2 days in a row once when they were especially short-staffed. Mostly she's been in the basement. And the basement is crowded, it's noisy, there's no decor, the lighting is harsh, it's hardly the stuff of dreams. The garments are still beautiful. Artie is looking right now at a black muskrat missus coat. Its glossy, almost oily shine draws the eye like a magnet. But they lose a bit of their glamour once they're here in the basement. And they lose a little bit more each time they spend the day getting banged around by the hands of 1,000 half-interested bargain seekers and urban idlers. But still, she can't really blame people for wanting a bargain. She herself has been known to keep an eye on a few items, watching the prices dropping, just like every other employee here in the basement, calculating schemes to get them home once they drop below a certain threshold. She can, and does, blame people, though, for treating her like a store fixture, an automaton that can change money and wrap parcels, but who isn't quite human. People look right through her. They pass without offering a greeting. They snap orders at her. They step on her toes. By the end of the day, typically, she feels about ready to return the favor, to stop thinking of the people roaming the aisles as people, to think of them instead as a single, faceless mass. The bell rings. The door opens. They begin to pour in, the customers. Artie watches them as they approach. Artie watches them. She thinks about Wednesday night's class. She remembers Winchell, that's her professor, Professor Winchell. She remembers Winchell walking them through Section 6 of Criminal Investigation, Knowledge of Men. She made a point yesterday of taking Winchell's teachings to heart. She made a project of being extra alert, extra observant of her surroundings. She tried as much as she could to stop thinking of the customers as an undifferentiated crowd, tried to train herself to see them once again as individual human beings, with traits that you could identify, commit to memory, recall later in the service of unraveling some mystery. She tried to figure out who had secrets that they were subtly revealing through their actions. Her conclusion? Everyone. It had been fun, and it had made her shift go faster. And more importantly, she could feel herself getting better at it, noticing details that she would never have noticed before. A rakish angle to a man's hat, the bitten nails of a woman in an elegant dress. The first customer to make it this far down her aisle pushes past her. Artie eyes his walrus mustache and sniffs inquisitively at his cologne, concludes he must be in league with some sinister syndicate. The day gets busy. A person needs something wrapped, then another one, and then there's a line. Before she knows it, Artie has spent an hour with her head down, folding brown paper and cutting twine. Not much in the way of good investigative opportunity there. With the morning rush having passed, she finally has the ability to walk the aisles for a minute, tidying disarrayed piles of scarves, rearranging hats. And then, in her ear, someone is saying her name. Artie, in a voice that seems hushed and urgent. Artie jumps. But it's only Theodore. Holy smoke, Theodore, she says, clapping her hand to her chest. Don't sneak up on people like that. Theodore, grimacing unapologetically takes 2 swift steps backward. At 6'5", with a wild sprig of unruly hair that makes him seem even taller, he's never been accused of being a graceful man, and Artie watches helplessly as Shoppers dodge his elbows. Plus, there's the folding tripod protruding from his rucksack, like an awkward extra limb pointing out stiffly behind him. Artie winces as it grazes the ostrich feather in an old lady's hat. One more step back and his tripod would have caught her right in the jaw. But the danger's been harmlessly averted, and Artie lets out her held breath. "What do you want?" she says, a bit more curtly than she really intends. She's annoyed at having been startled, doubly so because she's been priding herself on her resolution to be extra alert, extra observant of her surroundings. If a steep, ungainly man like Theodore can manage to get right next to her without her noticing, it seems like she has to keep practicing, and the reminder feels like a rebuke. But she's also glad to see him, standing there with his tentative, crooked smile, an olive branch offered from a safe distance. "I wanted to see how it went," he says. "How what went?" "The class," Theodore says, "at the men's college. In disguise," he adds as a conspiratorial aside. He utters the word disguise quietly, but it still feels foolhardy to Artie that he even says it out loud in public. She looks from side to side, trying to see if anyone around has heard. She's not really afraid that the president of the Evening Institute himself is down here rummaging about for a bargain overcoat, ready to expel her upon learning of her ruse, and more afraid that he'll be overheard by a coworker. This will be the provocation for some weird rumors about her to start spreading. Artie, with her cropped hair and squarish jaw, is already considered a bit odd by the other shop girls, and Theodore is an odd sight too. It's part of what brought them together, she thinks, despite the fact that he's from a wealthy family and she's from the laboring class. They're 2 strange people, and each of them realize that together they can navigate the world better than either of them could alone. Nonetheless, even by these standards, her friendship with him is unusual. She has a standing invitation to drop in at his townhouse, and she's been taking advantage of it, especially lately. The townhouse is warm, and Boston is getting cold, but she knows that most people wouldn't approve of a young, unmarried girl making an unsupervised call to the home of a young, unmarried man. Nothing untoward has ever occurred. Mostly he just shows her items excitedly from his collections of eccentric stuff. Photographic studies of animal locomotion by this guy Muybridge, phenakistoscope discs that produce a moving image when spun and viewed in a mirror, tiny reproductions of gloomy paintings produced by the French symbolists. But she keeps it quiet anyway. Her parents don't know that she's been going there. Her coworkers don't either. She worries that even showing up just to chat with her while she's working could be enough to provoke gossip. And that's before you take into account any loose remark about taking classes at a men's college. But no one seems to have heard. If Theodore's clumsy arrival and incautious comments give anyone pause, they've since gone back to their shopping. This is a thing Artie has noticed. There are a lot of strange men in the city. When one makes his appearance and nothing all that bad happens, people tend to just look the other way, especially if the man gives off the impression of having come from money. At most, an observer will give a sniff of distaste. It's not the same for strange women, though. For a moment, she feels a pang at the unfairness of the situation. That Theodore, a young man with wealthy parents, is able to get away with certain eccentricities that she, as a young woman, will be chastised for. Theodore gets to blunder awkwardly through the world, and no one really pays it any mind. But she gets criticized by strangers because she wears her hair short. He gets to be weird, and she doesn't. That's just the way it is. But sometimes she wishes it was different. His strangeness, though, is really part of the reason she's committed to the friendship. Yes, she enjoys having access for the first time in her life to some of the pleasures of the well-heeled life. True, she can go to a restaurant with him, even the down-and-tumble ones that he enjoys, and he'll pay for her meal. The novelty of that hasn't worn off. But she's more drawn to the fact that he'll stop in the street on the way, fish a scrap of paper from a small pocket of his blazer, and read a bit of some odd poem. She's more drawn to the fact that he does some unusual experiments with a little brownie camera, making ghostly images by exposing the film twice without advancing it. He did a photographic portrait of her face a few months back in summer, superimposed it over a photo of rippling water. She has it hanging now in a cheap frame in her bedroom at home. Sometimes he even gets a glassy, faraway look in his eye, and afterwards claims to have had a vision. It's a little spooky. She doesn't totally like it, but it's rather a remarkable thing to see. Most recently, he's been learning magic at the Boston School of Magic. Her coworkers would definitely gossip if they knew that. Though he hasn't gotten very far in his studies, as near as she can tell. The class, she says, remembering there's a question on the table, it went, well, it was a little complicated, but I think I'm learning a lot. About crime? Theodore asks. Yes, but another hasty look around the aisle. That's supposed to be a secret, remember? Yes, of course, Theodore says, although he looks vaguely distracted, and she isn't entirely sure that he's actually remembered. I did have something for you today, though. Something that came to my attention and that might also be of interest to you. That might, in fact, give you an opportunity to practice some of what you're learning in that area. In criminal investigation, Artie says, though she hates a little bit, now he's gotten her to say the supposedly secret part out loud. Yes. Well, what is it? The thing. It's an unsolved crime, Theodore says. Oh, Artie says. Her heart leaps. This does interest her. I want to hear more, she says quickly. But some impatient shopper edges his way between them. This probably isn't the right time or the right place. Can I meet you somewhere this evening when my shift is over? Absolutely, he says. Meet me at the Frog Pond. Stop there.
Awesome. Can people hear me? Okay. Well, thank you, Brookline Booksmith, for having us, and thank you, Jeremy, for being in conversation with me tonight, and thank all of you for coming. So, yep, that is my novel. It's called Palais Royale, but I'm actually not going to read from that tonight. There are copies available if you would like them. I'm going to read instead a couple of like microfiction pieces that I'm working on for a new collection that will hopefully be published. I also publish under the name Aidan Grace Smith, and so these pieces have been published under that name. Okay, I'm going to stand up. Works. Okay. Time travel. What happened to the bottle opener, I ask. What happened to the murder hornets, he counters. My partner has a theory that 2020 is proof that time travel exists. Seriously though, I say, pawing through the kitchen drawer. It contains a potato masher with a green wooden handle my mother purchased in the 70s and gave me when I got my first off-campus apartment in the hopes that, I suppose, I would be making a lot of mashed potatoes to accompany roast meats for college parties, or more likely because my mother has a habit of giving me things she herself no longer has a use for. Also wedged in there is a lime squeezer I bought when I was going through a margaritas phase, a gnocchi rolling board I explicitly asked for Christmas last year and had never used, a tiny spoon with an oversized plastic handle with which I used to deposit great dollops of pureed peas into my son's mouth, a spider I bought in Chinatown for reasons I no longer remember, several bent forks, no bottle opener. When I glance up from my fossicking, my partner gives me a look that quite clearly communicates I am serious, but throws me a bone. Try the back porch. Weren't we out there a couple days ago? His theory is this, that each unmitigated disaster that has so unbelievably befallen us this year can only be the result of human error on a scale heretofore unseen. That seeing what happened when the Boogaloo Boys came to power, our future scientists, humanist madmen, saviors all, nipped back into this timeline to quash it, inadvertently unleashing the murder hornets. Trying again, dauntless, the would-be heroes came back to annihilate the winged menace, only to create cancel culture. And on through a global pandemic, kids in cages, the closing of his favorite restaurant downtown, a beloved children's writer being exposed as a hateful turf when we all thought she was so wise, the demise of public education. Who knows what 2021 or 22 will bring? My partner sifts flour into a large bowl and puts a skillet on the burner to heat. He sets out 2 plates and our partially melted plastic spatula in preparation. He is making pancakes for dinner for the 3rd night in a row. His principal piece of evidence is that you never hear about the murder hornets anymore. They seem, he posits, to have dropped out of the timeline altogether. This from a man who used to be a physicist, which is why he thinks I should listen to him. I shoulder my way out to the back porch, through the door that sticks in the humidity, and look around. I left a Yale sweatshirt out there on one of our plastic deck chairs. An abandoned memoir I had been failing to read for 16 days is splayed open, cover side up on the glass top table. A citronella candle, perched on the railing, is collapsing in on itself in the heat. I pick up the book in case the bottle opener is concealed beneath it, but my action is listless and devoid of anticipation. Bereft, I sink into the unoccupied faux Adirondack. I don't even know anyone who went to Yale. I did used to know a trick for popping the top off of High Lifes by employing the bottom of a plastic Bic. I'm not sure I can still accomplish that. Looked at one way, the story my partner is telling is one about hubris. When he tells it, that is the moral arc he emphasizes. A siren wails up a couple streets away. Two dun-colored little birds sail by on their way to somewhere. Really, though, it is an optimistic tale my partner is spinning. Inherent in this idea is the notion that things cannot be this organically awful. That by and large, people want to make things better. That there will always be time to try again. I sit there for a long time in the gloaming until I start to smell melted butter from inside the house. Eventually, I get up to peer over the edge of the porch, try to spot the glint of a necessary item in the grass below, where perhaps it was accidentally dropped, or anyway fell, so that I can recover it. Okay. Cherry tomatoes. What does dead feel like? My daughter's therapist has instructed me to ask that when my daughter professes a wish to kill herself. I haven't had occasion this week to use the line on my kid, but since it was suggested to me, I can't stop asking. What does dead feel like? I asked the boneless, skinless chicken breasts wrapped and chilled in my hand in the supermarket. What does dead feel like? I whispered to the faces of ripe cherry tomatoes as I plucked them from their vine in my yard. What does dead feel like? I say, closing my eyes and letting myself float in a tepid bath. Later, my daughter, content for the moment with a carton of chocolate milk in one hand and a raspberry-filled granola bar protruding from her mouth, shows me videos of cartoon cats playing the bongos, the saxophone, the kalimba. Riding atop cartoon bands, these cats swap out theme songs, 80s hits, trance music, death metal. I think of all the things that have had to happen in the history of human life for these videos to be created. Each one took hours to code, to generate. Hundreds of researchers discovered or invented the mechanisms by which these moments were designed and beamed into the hands of my 12-year-old, and from there into my retina, where they are processed by my one brain. Do you really think we couldn't have cured cancer, I want to ask? Now this human collective, it seems to me, is a species with a death wish. My daughter crumples the granola bar wrapper and shoves it in her pocket. She covers my hand with one of her own, sticky and soft. I worked hard to arrange my features into what I hope is a look of appreciation. It's great, I say, unfolding myself from the couch, thinking of that chili chicken breast that I'll need to slide into a pan soon. You haven't even seen the one with the teacup pig, she says. Her face is shining with reflected light from her tiny screen, and I think of how long it takes for certain wavelengths to arrive from each cold star and what will be left when they get here. Thank you. This is my last one. And it's my Happy Pride Month, by the way, everyone. This is my transiest little story I'm going to read tonight. So, today, years old. Our eyebrows were already weird by the time we met. We were not new, but we had not been waiting either. We came trailing wedding rings, dildos, mortgages, baby bottles, prom dresses, surgical histories, seltzer makers, dead transmissions, at-home injection kits, rosary beads, old photographs, and new phones and empty whiskey bottles. Instead of asking for nudes, I asked you to send me a picture of a scar. You sent a close-up of a wine-dark birthmark. I had been hoping for the two long and beautiful pink lines across your chest. You asked me if I had ever had an abortion. I asked you what your name used to be. Instead, you told me that when you were 8, you wore a bat costume every day for 2 weeks. When your mother finally pried it off you and tucked you into bed in your My Little Pony pajamas, your face washcloth clean, you pretended to sleep. Hours later, you snuck into the laundry room. She came running at 3 in the morning when you, crouched on your bed, unfurled your wings and flew, toppling a bookcase full of Nancy Drew and Goosebumps. Now, I ask you to tell me again. Tell me about how you were a wild, half-formed thing in the night. Remind me that you and I are still not in our final forms. You fit yourself around my body. I slide 2 fingers into your vagina. In the mornings, we take turns reading the news and telling each other, this can wait. Don't look yet. It will be here later. For now, pull my ear to your mouth, your arms around my chest. Thank you. Okay, so
Good.
I have some questions for you.
I have some
And
questions
then
for you.
we'd love to take questions from you all at some point if you have any. But we'll start each other off. So first of all, congratulations. It's the first day that your book is out.
Thank you. In
Amazing.
fact, I only have this. This is like the advanced reader's copy. It says on sale June 2023. And seeing like this one, I've not yet gotten my author's copy. So like showing up here at Brookline is like the first time I've actually seen the finished book. And like, is it different from this version? A little bit, yeah. They look the best. Look different. Anyway, thank you for the congratulations.
Yeah. So I guess my first question is, what, if anything, was different for you about writing and publishing this book compared to your other books? We did not prepare these ahead of time, by the way.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I did not want to write a historical fiction, a piece of historical fiction. You know, like I don't. I read some historical fiction. Like I read Hilary Mantel's like Wolf Hall, those books, which are very good books. I don't know if anybody's read those books, but they're terrific. You know, but it's like you read them, and it's like then you read, you know, how did she imagine this time period so effectively? You know, then you read interviews with her, RMP. And she's like, oh yeah, I've got this note index where it's like, I know what happened like every day of like the 16th century or whatever. You're like, oh my God, you know? And I was like, I don't want to do that, you know? And then, you know, some other 2 books are written in the present, you know, and my first book was about like a writer. It's like a young guy, you know, and that was very easy to write. My second book was like someone who works in the restaurant industry, and that required some research. This one required like a lot of research. You know, it's been 7 years since my last book. You know, and like I would love to tell you that all that time was research, but you know, there was other stuff going on as your story so finally underlines. But that was different. You know, it's like stupid hard. You know, where it's like I want just like writing a sentence is like I wanted to describe like. Her emotions hit her like a wrecking ball, you know, and I was like, okay, it's 1909, like,
Did they have
is there a wrecking ball, you know, does a wrecking ball exist, how do you figure that out? So I go to like Wikipedia, what wrecking ball, you know, and it's like, there's nothing there, you know, and it's like, then you end up, you're in like Google Books or something, you end up like, someone has written like a history of demolition, and you're like, oh, cool, you know, and you learn like, no, they didn't have a wrecking ball, they had like, they were demolishing stuff with sledgehammers back then. It's like, oh, okay, great. So it's like, her emotions hit her like a sledgehammer, you know? And you're like, it took me all day. I wrote like one wrecking ball is at least 2 words, sledgehammer is just like 1 word. And then it's like, wow, I'm done for the day, you know? So that's horrible, you know, it's bad. And, you know, just like, can I say she has a blue dress? You know, it's like, well, I'll look at a photo from the time. It's photos, but they're all black and white. And it's like, all right, is that blue or is it brown? Like, did they have? It's like, is it reasonable to believe that like a working class person would have like a dress that was dyed blue? I don't even know. So that was slow. That was slow going, and that's probably, I think it's the biggest difference. You know, this story is also a little bit more like a mystery. Like there's clues, you know, and like you can kind of piece together like what is happening. You know, and it's more in that genre than my other stuff. You know, so that was the difference too. But I think the big difference was just writing historically. You know? Yeah. Which I will say, the last thing I'll say about it is like, I was kind of glad because I did write this like through the worst months of the pandemic, through the lockdown, through 2020, you know, I was writing this, and I was just like, oh, thank God I'm not writing a book that's set in the present, you know, because it was like, well, what do you do, you know, like, do you rewrite the whole book to be like, no, now everyone's wearing masks, you know, or like, now everyone's like in their living room or whatever. I couldn't write, I don't think I could write a pandemic novel. Or I didn't know how, or I didn't know what this would look like in a year, you know, in a year it's going to be like in our apartment, so or what, you know? So I was like never more glad, and I'm like, thank God I'm writing something just advice like forever ago, and like, you know, there's no pandemic in the future in 1909. Nothing coming down the pike for these characters. Yeah, they got a smooth sailing for a long ass time. Yeah, so that was something that I was modestly grateful for as I was busy researching. Is there a wrecking ball? You know? And that actually leads nicely to my first question for you, which is you have your novel here, but you read short pieces. And you write well on both scales, which is nice. I only write good novels. I tried to. I can't even finish a short story. I can only finish novels, which is like kind of messed up. So I guess I wanted to ask you like a similar question. Like, what's different with this novel than the other novels? But like, what do you feel is different from writing at like novel scale versus like short story scale, and in some cases like very, very short. Some of these are just like, well, like a couple pages. They're micro or flash. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I started writing like short stories, and I loved writing short stories, and I love that it's like you're writing a moment into the world, right? And it is very self-contained, and it has an arc, and like when it's done, it's done. And so I really love the short story form. I love reading them. I love writing them. That's what I started out doing. And then eventually, and in fact, actually, I went to Bard for my undergrad, and I was a creative writing major. And Bard, at that time, Bard had this like amazing policy that no undergrads were allowed to write novels, like at all. Which I think they eventually had to get rid of because people like rioted or something. But I think it's a great policy, right? Because if you can learn how to write a short story, like it's longer than a micro, it has to have substantial character development and arc and all of that. But like it has to be tight, right? I think if you can learn how to write that, and that gives you a foundation for writing novels. That said, Palais Royale is my first novel. I have another novel after that that has not been published yet. But I wrote that when I first wrote this, like the very first version of Palais Royale, I wrote when I was 26 years old, and that was a million years ago. I'm very old. And I wrote it and then had to immediately rewrite the entire thing because you have so much to learn about pacing if you've only written short stories, right? And it was like, it was short, it was fast, like everything happened right away, and then I was like, oh my god, it's like 80 pages, what is that? It's not a thing. And then the rest of the novel, like nothing happened, I don't know. So I had to totally rewrite it. And that was a really important like learning curve for me. But yeah, I just recently went back to writing, I'm writing another novel, but I went back to writing a lot of micro stuff, sort of as a break because although I first started writing like full-length short stories, when I was first getting published, it was all micro stuff that I got published. And I just love writing micro stories. They're super fun.
Does it flex different muscles, or is it just like a novel but short and with no pacing? Or like what do you think is like? What skills do you implement? I guess.
I mean, I think obviously when you write like a literary novel, language matters, but in a micro, like language really matters. Like every single word matters, and that feels really fun. And the other thing too is that like for me, if I'm writing a micro, like it could be inspired by an idea or something. One of these stories was inspired by somebody who's here today. I was like, give me a prompt. I had like no ideas, and Thomas was like, bottle opener. What are you gonna do with that? And I was like, hold on, I've got it. But so, I think you can get inspired by something really small and just bang it out. And the great thing about a micro is that like, if it's complete trash, you can just throw it away, and you've not spent a year on it. It doesn't matter. You can just throw it out. And if there's something there, then you can revise it. And it's that like, making it incredibly pointed, getting that. Instead of an arc, it sort of has a turn, I would say, like 3/4 of the way through. So yeah, it's a little different. I have a genre question for you too, though.
Wonderful.
So yeah, in your bio, it says you write about magical claptrap, right? Which I think has been your Twitter bio for like a million years.
It has. It's not currently, but it's been for a long time.
So tell me a little bit more about A, what that means, and B, like, why magic, right? And like, what are, why do you love it? How do you do it well? I think I teach, and all of my students are incredibly brilliant, but I have also seen young writers really struggle to do magic well. So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple different ways that I can answer that question, I guess. So I'll have to choose one, I suppose. Yeah, we're gonna go into the multiverse here and do like every possible answer. Now, I don't know, like, there's some writer, I think it's George Saunders, who writes wonderfully about writing. And George Saunders has been like, when I first started writing, it's like I wanted to be Hemingway, you know, so I'm like writing all these like stories where I'm pretending that I'm like Hemingway. I'm like, I'm in Spain, you know, and like I'm watching the bullfights or whatever. And he's like, they were all terrible, of course, and he's like, I realized that like my body of work was not going to be, I think he calls it Hemingway Mountain. You know, he's like, my body of work was not going to be Hemingway Mountain. And he's like, my body of work was going to be like Saunders Mountain, and Saunders Mountain was going to be made up of like different stuff, you know, where it's like I didn't spend my like, you know, childhood years like doing whatever Nick Adams did when he was a kid, you know, or whatever young Hemingway did, fishing, you know, whatever. He's like, I spent it like watching like Hogan's Heroes on TV or whatever, you know, or like dealing with like to a certain degree like trash, you know. But he's like, I realized I could put those things together into like stories that made sense for me, you know. It's kind of like a sort of fancy way of saying like write what you know, or like, you know, your influences are your influences, you know, and like don't try to clone someone else's influences because it's never gonna work, you know. And in your own life, there's trash and there's grandeur and there's good and there's bad and there's the sublime and there's everything else, you know. And I think that's sort of why like magic shows up in my stuff, you know, where it's like when I was a kid, it was like I like to read, you know. I've always liked to read. I always like to read like difficult, great literature, you know. Like I read my Anna Karenina, and I read my, you know, modern writers who are writing like difficult, minimalist novels.
Until you were a grown up.
Sure, but you know, life is long. You know, I didn't mean to say I read Anna Karenina when I was a kid, but like, you know, I did read stuff when I was a kid. But like, you know, some of the early stuff that I read was like Stephen King. You know, it's like horror is in my like DNA. You know, some of that I read when I was a kid was like Dungeons and Dragons books. You know, some of the stuff that like I read was like comic books. You know, and for a long time, I tried to like suppress that stuff in my work and just be like, my work is about people in the modern world living like modern, complicated lives, you know. And then I was like, in a way, I was like, it's not true to like the ferment that's in my head. You know, the ferment in my head always wants something to be like, now we're gonna jump in like a space car and like, you know, fly into the weird dimension X or whatever. You know, it's like, okay, so like, let some of that stuff out. And like the weirdness is like the book where I started to like let some of that stuff out. And I was like, I'm putting in like werewolves in this shit, you know. I'm looking at like werewolves having sex, you know, because I'm like, that's sort of a spoiler for the movies. But it's like a werewolf sex scene, and I was like, that's what I really care about, you know. And you know, it's like I think the weirdness tells a story that's about recognizably human things, you know, and it's human concerns at its core. But like, it also really deeply cares about like, how would a werewolf work? How would a werewolf open the door? You know, what if I had like a sonic blast that could shoot out? You know, it's like I'm thinking about that stuff, and yeah. So it's like, and not only is an accident, that was like the first book of mine to get published. It wasn't the first novel I'd written. You know, it was like the first one that I think was true to like that stuff that was like in my DNA. You know, so that's that, I guess. We have another part of that. Oh, what would you say to students who are?
Just like, you know, how do you do it well?
How do you do it well? I mean,
You know?
the way that I do it well, sort of, I don't overthink it. You know, like I think that can be the problem with young people who want to write fantasy. You know, I didn't really want to write fantasy. I came back to fantasy like kicking and screaming. You know, and I think when young people want to write fantasy, it's like they get very caught up in the world building aspect of it. You know, it's like you and I both teach young writers, and then we both have seen those writers who are like, I have to plan out my fantasy world to like the final detail. I got to work out what are the patterns on their dinner plates, you know, before I can like put my characters in a situation. You know, I've got 10,000 years of lore, you know, written out or whatever, and it's like you forget that it's like every book has to be like humans in a room. You know, my bio's like magical claptrap, but also ordinary human confusion. You know, and unless you get both those things, it's like not going to work. So I think students like they grab onto the magical claptrap thing and they want to like develop that and think that through and stuff like that. They don't think as much about the human confusion part. I think that's an error. You know?
Yeah, I think it's a good way actually of talking about it, because I think you're right with the like lore and the world building can take over, but also I think, you know, when you do sort of magic well, and I think that you do, it's because you never let magic solve the human problems, right? Magic solves the magic problems, but the humans still have to get themselves in and out of trouble, because that's what we read for, right? We read to watch characters get in trouble and then maybe try to get out of it.
That's a good answer. Yeah.
So, yeah.
I also said I don't overthink it as a system. You know, so you talk to like real fantasy writers, you know, and they'll always be like, I've got this magic system that's totally unique or whatever. And they'll be like, people will ask me, something like, what's the magic system like in your novel? I'm like, I don't know. Like, people like move their hands and it does weird stuff. You know, so that's like all I really think about it with it. So if you're looking for like a really robustly developed like magic system, like my books are not going to do that. It's like it's magic, but it's just like the thing people can do. You know, sort of. Okay, I got another question for you. We know one another. You know, we met. We're in the same writing group.
I was actually just, here's the question that I had to ask you. I hear you have the most amazing and prestigious writers group of all time. Can you speak to the importance of writing community?
I can speak to the importance of
Jake
writing
is also
community.
in our writing
Jake's also in our writing group. There's another guy who didn't want to make the drive, so he left us high and dry today. But, yeah, we got this writing group. All three of my books were forged in the crucible of my writing group, you know, and I think it's been hugely valuable. The books would, of course, be enormously different without the input of the writing group, every step of the way. So yeah, I guess that's my question for you, is because I came into the writing group after it was already formed.
Yeah.
And you were the founder of the group. So like, you know, if I'm to speak for like, what was the phrase of can you speak to the value of a writing community?
The most amazing and prestigious
Yeah,
writers group.
if I was going to speak about the most amazing and prestigious writers, it's like, yeah, none of these books would exist without the group. The very first book, The Weirdness, is dedicated to the writing group, you know. But I guess my question for you is like, why form one in the first place?
Yeah.
And I know people are always curious, at least my students are, when they hear that I'm in a writing group and when they hear that I attribute some of my success to the writing group, they're always like, well, how do I find one? Or how, you know, how do I start one? You know, or something like, if you have tips for anyone in the audience who's going to start a writing group, you know,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. To be totally honest, I founded this writing group because I'd been out of grad school for a while. I wasn't in like workshops. There were some workshops available around, and you had to pay lots of money to be in them, and that was not something that I was able to do or interested in doing, quite frankly. But I was teaching at the Cambridge Center for Adult Education. I was teaching like creative writing classes for a little while. And I knew I couldn't do that anymore because I got a job that was too time consuming to continue doing that, which has been really fun. And so I just collected my 4 best students and I was like, hey, do you guys want to form a writers group? So teach at the Cambridge Center for Adult Education and steal your best students. But no, I mean, go to classes and meet people, and if you want to form a writers group, that's a really good way to do it, I think. I think it's really important to me, not just in terms of like the quality of my work and being able to get input and revising it, but to have like a real community of writers, and you know, that sort of lift each other up, and hang out with each other. And I think to have that be really authentic, like nobody in our group is like showing up trying to like network with each other. We just want to like drink too much wine and talk about stories, you know, and make each other's stories better. And so I think, you know, finding people in that community who you actually really like being around, and who, you know, who want to make your work better, and whose work you in fact want to read, is really important. It's been great. Like this writers group's been going for just like 20 years or something. We meet once a week. I would also recommend meeting at a bar, which helps a lot. So.
I'll also add that like what our writing group doesn't do is it's not a support group or an accountability group. So I think there's a place for those, but like our group can be mean. You know, we're not mean, but we're harsh. No, we're not. We're critical.
Very critical.
So we're looking for, you know, and like, you know, we don't pull punches, we don't mince words, and there have been many times where I've brought chapters to the group and the group's been like, this needs a total. overhaul, total rewrite, you know. And I mean, like, that sucks. You know, it's really is bad. It really feels bad, you know. But the book is better at the end. You need a thick skin to persevere in the publishing world in general. We're getting a little tight on time, so I want to do the gender question.
Oh, okay. So, all right, we have one last question, and then a couple minutes, hopefully, to hear from you all. So, I think we need to talk about gender and your novel. I think that's important. You've written a character who is assigned female at birth, who would likely, in the year 2023, identify as trans of some flavor. You are not assigned female at birth, and so I guess my question is, how do you do that well? Why do it? Why make that choice? And why you?
Okay.
Right?
I mean, that's a great question. That's part of why I want to make sure we had time for it.
I mean, it's of course particularly important right now. When trans people are more visible and also more in danger than certainly at any time in my life.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, I'm a cis writer writing a character who, like, it's not clear from the early part of this book, but as the book goes on, it's like I sort of, in a lot of the synopses online, people will be like, oh, she, like, disguises herself as a man to, like, get into, like, even I introduced it that way at the start of the night to a certain degree. But, like, it's important to know that, like, she's also having these gender feelings where she's like, I'm not sure that, like when I put on the suit, I feel like more myself than like when I'm wearing the dress, and like I can think more clearly, and like I feel more grounded in like what does that mean? I want to keep my hair cut short, like kind of lying to myself and saying like that's like a fashion in Paris, like she kind of knows that's not true, So like that stuff is there, I did want to do it well, and to do it well, I mean the answer is kind of what you'd expect. Like you read works by trans writers, you as much as you can, you talk to trans people and you show them the book and say like, how does this feel right to you? And they'll say yes or they'll say no or they'll fix parts of it for you or whatever. But like the question of like why me is an important question. There's this internet comic that maybe some of you have seen where there's like I don't know, it's like a frog and a mouse or something like that, and the frog and some other animal, and the frog is like, I have my story too, and the mouse butts in and it's like, that's right, I'm like, I shall tell your story, and the mouse goes on to tell the story of like the frogs to other mice, and the frog is kind of like, it's still not my story, and I don't want to be like the mouse in the story, like I don't claim, when we're talking about these questions and events, we're like, I want to talk about like the own voices, like issue, and like I don't claim that my book is like the own voices book, and if you, I would hope that you're interested in like the trans experience, so like you wouldn't start with my book, it's like I don't think that's a good place to start. At the same time, it's like when we do look at the world today, it's like, I mean, I just put it as blunt as again. It's like there's a fucking war on, and it's like that's the culture war is real war, and it's really costing people their lives. Like, you can't put it more bluntly than that. So I'm like, well, what can I do? If you're just sitting there doing nothing, then like I think that's wrong. I think that's a moral fault. So like I can do some things well. I can write fiction reasonably well. So I'm like, fiction, at the end of the day, like fiction is not memoir, I don't write this book to be like, I'm a trans person telling trans experience, it's like, fiction is a technology of imaginative experience, so it's in part that I do want people to see me, like, imagining myself in, like, trans person's shoes. So maybe some other cis person will be like, hey, I can imagine myself in, like, a trans person's shoes for, like, 5 minutes, And also just, like, yeah, that I hope people pick up my book because, like, they don't know that it has anything at all to do with gender, and then pick it up because they wanted to, like, read a trans person's story, and then, like, as they read it, they're like, oh, like, I imagine myself in this situation, and, like, I have something of a better understanding of, like, what is happening to trans people. You know, it's just one part of like a big initiative, you know, and I just try to do my part, I guess.
Okay.
I do want to ask for you, like, I know we're going to jump out to the Q&A, but I do want to ask, like, do you think the publishing scene for trans writers is it rosy? Is it not rosy?
Yeah, I don't know.
What's the story there?
Yeah, I don't know. So I am a trans writer, and I think, you know, again, it's like everything else, right? Like, there's more visibility than ever in my lifetime, certainly, but also more danger. I mean, as you described it as a war, I would say, like, there's a really good chance that one of two people who are literally calling for genocide will be elected president in the near future. So, you know, and I think that that's true it's true largely in the country and the world, and that's reflected in the publishing industry. You know, I think that there's some ways in which, like, you know, I put it in my bio, and I know that, like, some publishers are gonna be like, ooh, that checks the diversity box. Let's look at that. And, like, yeah, like, cool, awesome, I'll take it. Are you kidding? But at the same time, like, obviously, I want my work to be celebrated for the robustness of what it is, beyond that, you know. And also, you know, the trans population is, like, got all this huge spotlight on us. It's the tiniest little piece of the population, right? And it's an even tinier piece of the publishing world. And I think there have been some really great new trans books out in the last couple of years. I don't see a slight sweep in the nation, though. So I don't know. I mean, the publishing world is difficult for everybody. It's extra difficult for people from historically marginalized backgrounds. I don't see that changing terribly rapidly, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Anyway. I think we have time for a couple questions, if anybody has any questions. Okay. Yeah, we have time for a couple questions. Yeah?
Are there any pages of novels that if you took them out would make a good micro, or is that just structurally wrong?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think usually, I mean, I want to say no, right? Because they're totally different forms, and I think largely that's true. I will say though that I had my students do this at the end of the semester because they were restless. There's a journal called 6-Sentence Stories, which is kind of cool. It's online. It just sort of looks like somebody's blog, but it's actually got, like, great authors in it. And so I was like, we have, you know, whatever, 45 minutes left in the class. Like, either write a 6-sentence story and submit it to this journal. Go. And of course, everybody can write 6 sentences. Maybe it's trash, but maybe you can, you know, maybe it'll be great. And I was like, or go back and mine all of the things that you wrote this semester that are in fact trash, and see which sentences you can pull from them, and either use it as inspiration or, like, I had one student who literally did find, like, the 6 good sentences next to each other in one story, and it happened to sort of actually make sense as a little bit of a narrative arc, and I was like, perfect, send it off. So sometimes, you know.
So this is a question for both. So I'm curious about, you guys mentioned earlier a magic system, and I was wondering, do you pull from your understanding and knowledge of magic, just historically speaking, or did you create your own magical system, so to speak? Does this question make sense?
It does make sense, and
Okay.
I'm going to say only Jeremy, in fact, can answer this question. I think one time something happened that was improbable.
Yeah, and I'm anti-system, you know, like I really am, you know, just like magic in a book is like when something weird happens, you know, and it's like if you have characters in your book who can do magic, there are people who can make weird stuff happen, you know, and it's like there's a little bit more to it than that, where it's like the character Theodore, he spends like the whole book trying to learn like one spell, you know, so it's like, all right, so there's a little bit of a system there where it's like, we know this thing called spells, like the spell has a name, it can be taught, it takes time to learn, you know, it's like, there's a little bit of system that like creeps in there. In terms of like, and my other books is a little different, you know, each book is a little bit of a different relationship to magic, you know, so each time it's a little bit, I wouldn't say they're totally compatible, you know, each one's got a little bit of a different twist to it. So like systems creep in, but I don't really pre-plan that stuff, you know. Now, to get to the bigger part of your question of like, where does it come from? It's like, yeah, some of it comes from like I know my way around like the historical occult, you know, and I'm interested in the historical occult, and I can talk about Aleister Crowley until the sun comes up if you want, you know, but nobody wants me to do that, I don't think. But yeah, all right, sure, I'll give you my email. I can talk about this stuff, and I know that stuff, and some of that trickles in. You might look at it and go like, oh, like that's like kind of taken from chaos magic or like whatever, you know. And some of it is just straight up like stolen from Dungeons and Dragons, you know, or like some other thing like that, or just being like, yeah, I just watch a lot of movies where people like go like this and a big glowing thing appears, you know, or whatever. Like that's you know, it's all goes in the hopper, you know, and something comes out that hopefully makes sense and is cool. You know? That's my system. Is like, is it cool? You know?
I guess just a quick thought. You were talking a bit earlier about kind of the difference between writing short stories and novels. And I myself, I think I have the opposite issue from what you do. I've written I've written actually 2 novels. One is lost forever due to a hard drive problem. The other is not good and needs to be rewritten completely from scratch. But I've never, outside of a class I took in high school, I've never managed to finish a single short story since then, no matter how many I've started. So it's, you mind, is it, like you were talking about it in terms of muscles, but is there like just a different mentality and approach in general? I think short stories that makes them more accessible if you think one way, than whereas novels are more accessible if you think about it in another way. I'm just interested to kind of hear your, actually both of your thoughts on that distinction.
Yeah, I can
elaborate.
I think like, first of all, like when you think about short stories, well, first of all, I think it's a great exercise. If you write novels, like to just set yourself down and say, I am going to finish a short story, even if it's terrible. But the way that I usually start thinking about them is it's sort of one of 2 ways. Either what is the moment that I want to write about, right? There are moments in your life that you remember because they're horrifying, or because they're beautiful, or because it's just an image that's stuck in your brain of like that thing that you saw and it meant something to you. And like, how do you build a story around that moment? Who's getting to that moment, or who's just left that moment, and why? Or you start with, very basically like, who is your character, and what does your character want? And then, you have 20 pages or less to either see them fail spectacularly to get it, right, or get a little bit closer. I don't know. How do you think about it?
As someone who shares your problem, when I've probably written more novels than I've written like short stories, successful short stories. I guess the way I think of it is I'm like, a short story is like making a beautiful, intricate sandcastle. You start with like something that's totally blank. You labor on it all day and you build it up and up and up. And it's not gonna be huge, but like you build it to the size it is and you focus in on little details, Then at the end of the day, you send it out and a wave comes in and it's gone, And writing a novel, it's like pushing a giant snowball like down a hill, where it's like it gets its own momentum. To me, like waking up each day and like making a fresh new sandcastle, I'm like, man, that's a lot of labor, Whereas like pushing this giant snowball, it's like it's its own form of labor, but like at a certain point, it's got mass behind it that helps to push it along, So it's like I'm working on this novel. I wake up, I make my coffee, I like stand in front of the computer, I'm at a standing desk, and I'm like, I don't have to like make up a whole new situation or imagine a whole new moment. All I gotta do is get from page like 294 to 295, and it's like, that's easy, for me that's easy, For me it's like starting from the blank sand that's like challenging,
I mean, yeah, and I think you can certainly learn, no matter what kind of writer you are, what you're interested in, to do both kinds of writing. I think some of us are naturally marathoners and some of us are naturally sprinters, right? But like, I think you kind of learn how to do all the forms. You have one more question? There's one last question.
Bring it home, somebody. Great.
Yeah, you were talking about writing groups, and I was just warn people I was in 3 writing groups, and I think they're super important and they really taught me how to write, but it's also kind of, my first novel, constantly I was revising based on what people were saying in my group, and that was kind of dangerous, so it took forever. And it was terrible, so I really loved the group, and like I said, it was really valuable, and I would not change that, but I definitely think you should start with the novel finish, with a shitty first draft, and then start with it, or bring it to the group.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways of doing it, but I think it's really, like, I think you bring up an important point, that it's really important when you go into, whether it's a workshop or a writer's group or like, you know, whatever, sort of constructive criticism situation, to remember that, like, you only take the advice that feels right to you, right? You cannot listen to every reader about everything, right? You basically know, and you gotta find, you know, the job of your readers is to tell you, like, what's on the page and what's not to get into it, right? So yeah, that's a good thing to remember.
Yeah, I have nothing to add. You just said it perfect.
Watch out for bad writers.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's more bad ones than there are good ones, but fine.
That's what I said, you
it's
know,
margin, yeah.
Find people in your community who really are your community, who want to be your community, and who you want to be in community with, you know.
Yeah, it's harder than it sounds, but yeah, it works out. So we got lucky, I guess.
All right, well, thank you all.